One of the things I failed to mention is that the implementation of the 5 reforms has to happen simultaneously. Now, 2 things. The other thing you mentioned, which was fantastic, was currently anything that's below ground is the government's. It's not in private property. Part of the privatization reforms and the economic reforms is privatizing the subsoil. I'm sure many of you, because you have neighbors fairly close by here, you saw the transformation of the Dakotas over the last 10 years with fracking and the exploitation of oil. That was only possible because it's private. If that was government-owned, it would have never happened. You would have never had a business case that made sense to make the investments in the technology to get fracking to work in a marketable business sense. Now, going back to the gold standard. So if you're a student of economics and you have a big, huge economic boom because you liberalize the market, you open markets, you deregulate, what happens? Inflation, crazy inflation. So to offset the crazy inflation, you return to the gold standard. You strengthen the Guatemalan quetzal, you give it real backing. Now that can happen overnight because it's not only the gold that's in the ground, the gold is in the treasury. That's the gold that counts. Those are the real reserves. And besides, the gold that's in the ground belongs to the people, not to the state. So the idea is to that's basically, it's a process. You have to buy in the international markets gold little by little, and the return to the gold standard is something that's going to take some time. But the idea is to start to fix it against gold and to slowly move that way. But the idea is to have exactly a counterbalance of the inflationary effects of a very hot economy against a deflationary effect in terms of monetary policy. One of the largest issues right now is all the conflicts that are occurring around mining. What happens? A mine deals with the government, gets a concession to mine in a particular community. What does the community get? Nothing. And so in that case, that's what's really raising the conflict. If the property, if the land is owned by them, who gets the benefit and who gets the majority of the? Because right now the royalties that are being paid are around 3 to 5% of what's extracted. That's what the government gets. I mean, for the Canadian mining companies and the American mining companies, that's a bonanza. I mean, it's free money. But the idea is for that wealth. This strategy is a wealth creator, and so it is for that wealth to stay in Guatemala, to be reinvested in Guatemala, and so people don't have to migrate and you don't break up families. And so and then again, obviously, all the other things of economic reform, creation of opportunity, liberalizing of markets, all that's going to create opportunity. It's going to, the idea, in fact, is for the Guatemalans that want to, they can return to greater opportunities. And we've seen this trend in countries like Romania. Romania is one of the great success stories of in the last years of the Soviet bloc. There was tremendous migration into Europe and into the United States of Romanians. When the wall falls and Romania modernizes and turns into a capitalist society, you see the reverse effect. You start to see all these Romanians returning to their homes, investing with all the knowledge and capital they acquired overseas or in other countries, and obviously that gives a great boost to the economy. So we hope that's the thesis we have, and that's what we believe is going to happen.
How is going to identify the 800 leaders to be trained, etc. And the other thing is you didn't show a timetable for the stages.
Okay, very good. Thank you for your observations. Again, see, this is why you have to have questions, because people poke holes in it, and then you get a chance to respond. The first stage has to be done in about a year from now. We've been at it for about 1 year, and we have a 2-year deadline for it. Why? Because the idea is that we have the political party formed and established in time for the next election. We're going to have this is our projection is we're going to have in the first election, we're going to have many legislators go in, but it's not going to be a majority or even near a majority. So the idea is we have to go in and provide a strong opposition, a contention bar. I don't know if any of you remember a guy named Ron Paul. He was known as Dr. No, because basically any proposal to increase the size of government, he would stand up and say, no. So that's our focus for the first period. In the second period, then the idea is that we're starting to change public opinion, which is stage 2, and we're able to get a lot more legislators into the chamber, into the legislature, and begin to change the laws. Excellent question, thanks.
Just a follow-up question for that. You said women in political party. Are you referring to Guatemala only or to any other country?
The strategy is the same for all the countries we're working in Latin America. Guatemala right now is the one that's furthest along in the process, followed by Peru, Ecuador, and then Bolivia and Argentina. Those are kind of at the same level, as well as Paraguay. But Guatemala is the one who's the leader right now, and we're already in the process of establishing the basis to basically create the political party.
So you have 5 countries on the line already to...
Yeah.
So I had a bit of a question about these two.
Just a little closer to your, yeah.
Sorry, I had a question about these two. So you mentioned briefly about gathering public support. So I would like to know a little bit more about that because I like this plan, makes a lot of sense. I don't know why I haven't heard about this before. It's awesome. But I think to gather support for a political movement, there has to be a cultural background to it. So that means that there has to be a shift and a change in culture, which is very hard to do. So what are some more of the details of gathering that public support, changing the culture to support this reform in law?
Okay. Again, I love it. Great questions. All right, so you're right. Changing public opinion is a monumental task. We have 2 strategies. The first is during the last election, the vast majority of the population actually didn't vote, either because they voted with their feet and they left the country. They're totally dissatisfied with what's offered in terms of political, and we actually had 27 different political parties propose candidates, by the way. So there was a lot on offer, but it was, nobody was really interested in what they had to offer. And so we're going after that vast majority, of that almost 70% of population who is dissatisfied or simply is politically apathetic and not interested in participating in the political process. Now, the second part of the question is how we're going to do that. So one of the strategies we've been working on probably until about 6 months ago was focused in Guatemala City. And we came to a sort of an epiphany maybe back about 6 or 7 months ago, which is the hardest part of the population to convince of this strategy is actually, ironically, the urban middle class. And even though none of them are users of any of these main services of the government and are obviously daily affected by all these bad laws, and I actually wrote an article, I might translate it, because I wrote an article called The Matrix. They live in the Matrix. I don't know if any of you saw the movie back in the 90s, I think, of The Matrix. But basically, they live in the Matrix. They live in this clouded world where they can't really perceive the actual reality. And what is that? And this goes back to a little bit more philosophical, but I'll touch on it very quickly. As human beings, we have a natural inclination to want to be good to one another. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And what has happened over time, and then going back to, again, the spheres, the private and the public sphere, we have relegated much of that taking care of the other to the public sphere. If we see somebody with need, we pass the buck, and we say, oh, the government will take care of it. And we don't take action. Here's a little interesting factoid. Can you tell me how many people died of hunger during the Great Depression? Anybody here? Actual died of hunger in the United States during the Great Depression in the 1930s. None. They were malnourished, but nobody died of hunger. And you know why? Because of the soup kitchens. And who ran the soup kitchens? The private sphere. I mean, there was the Tennessee Valley Authority and all these macro huge infrastructure projects that obviously kicked in movement into the economy. But in terms of caring for others, and did I share the volcano story? No, I didn't share that one. But there's another one. But basically, society, the private sphere, people from their own homes provided what little they could, and nobody went hungry. So what has happened is the government has usurped and taken away our ability to act, our liberties to influence in the private sphere. And it's gotten so bad that we assume that that's the norm and that's the way it should be. And so we pass the buck on to the government. We say, oh, the government will take care of it. And at least here I can't claim the same thing, but in Guatemala, one of the questions I always ask when we get these kinds of gatherings is I say, tell me one thing, only one, that you think the government can do with excellence. And this is, I get just quiet stares. Nobody, because nobody can come up with one. And their minds racing and thinking, and they can't come up with a thing. And that's why, because at least in Guatemala, you can't really say that the government does anything, any one thing with excellence.
So I have like 3 questions, if I may. If I may, super
Shoot.
quick. The first one is a follow-up on the BYU story. I forgot your name, I apologize.
A little closer to the mic, a little closer. There you
So
go.
the first one is a follow-up on the BYU student.
Yep.
I forgot your name. Carlos, okay. Good to meet you. So the question was, what about removing protections for minorities, right? And yes, under the law, everyone is equal, right? Just like in the U.S., all men are created equal.
Mm-hmm.
But during slavery, even though all men were created equal according to the law, black people were only 5/7 of a person,
Mm-hmm.
right? Even though the law was written.
Yep.
And then women didn't have equal rights until the 20s, and then we had the 1960s with
Civil rights.
civil rights movement, right? So I understand that under the law is the law, but for some reason, and I'm sure you understand Guatemalans, there's Latinos who actually are racist against their own people, against Native Americans. So how do we fix that? That's the first question. Sorry. The second one, because I don't want to go back and forth. I'm going to get.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
So the second one is regarding your plan of getting rid of different programs or entities that don't work. And yes, they don't work. We understand that, right? And corruption and everything else. But they're there. And different social programs. How are you going to work against pushback from people who are used to that and say, well, you're going to come into our country and get rid of social programs? Right? How are you going to work with the pushback? And the last one is I didn't hear anything in your plan about protecting the environment. When there is mining, when there is fracking, we understand the implications on the environment. So you may not probably didn't have enough time to actually talk about that. But
Yeah, I know.
what is your plan about protecting the environment?
Okay. Man, really, really great questions. Fantastic. All right. Your question 1 and 3 are more or less along the same lines. So it was protecting people's rights, if I may surmise, and the environment. Part of the political reform is strengthening of the courts. In all of the cases you cited, going back to the establishment of the country, women's rights in the 20s, and civil rights, what was the weakness at that time of the system itself? The weakness was the courts. The laws weren't adequately implemented. Slavery maybe it's a little bit different because that was in the law, and that was a major social change. But let's take the last century at least, about the last century. The idea is to have adequate and strong courts with sufficient resources, and I didn't even mention that, but to be able to resolve the cases adequately, and so that really you have true equality before the law, which doesn't happen today. Today you have very special interest groups that get a particular piece of law passed that favors them or opposes somebody else, and it creates an uneven playing field. The idea is to have a level playing field, and so that's resolved through the courts. Okay, and in terms of protecting the environment, Jorge is really the champ on that, but I'll try to answer it. Basically, when you have private property, your best interest is to maintain that property in its most fruitful and in its best condition. That's in your best self-interest. And when somebody infringes on the neighbor's property, if you have a good court system, you take them to court, and the court will basically say, either you need to restitute this other party, or or basically suffer the consequences, right? So that's sort of the principles that we're working on. But great question. And your second question, I'm sorry, because I jumped on 1 and 3.
The pushback from public.
Okay, great. Yeah, great question. So I didn't finish that last thought. I was mentioning the urban middle class. It's very difficult to deal with the urban middle class. We've noticed this over the last 6 months or so. That we get great amount of pushback, and it's because they can't conceive of the government not taking care of the poor. They themselves have never used a public service. They've never sent their children to public schools. They don't depend on a public pension. They don't depend on public health services. They wouldn't even in their wildest dreams take their children, or they themselves use those services. But they can't, and this is the matrix part, they can't fathom the idea that they would, that safety net wouldn't be available for the poor. And when you speak to the poor, and you speak to people in rural areas where there isn't even government presence, they get this. Why? Because they're not users of the service, and when they have to use it, you're basically standing in line for 12 hours to see a doctor. Or you're sending your kids to school where there's no roof, or it leaks, there's no desks, and the teacher doesn't show up half the time. And so the alternative sounds fantastic, because they're in a monopolized situation. They have no other recourse. When you give them the voucher system, they choose where they want to go get service. So they can choose which doctor they want to go to. They can choose where they want to send their children to school. They can choose where they want to save for their retirement years. So again, the idea is to return the liberty, return the rights to people, which unfortunately is what we've lost.
How do you plan to work? Do you work independently to the government, or do you want to work with the government? To work in Guatemala is very risky, it's very dangerous. If you don't share the political system with the government.
Mm-hmm.
That is my question, and I would like to know also if you plan to Spanish meetings for those that don't speak English.
Answering your last question first, we can definitely have Spanish meetings. Encantado de la vida. The second question is, we're basically going to become the government. We're going to take the legislature and rewrite the rule book. So we're going to change the rules, and that you have to change the system. The system is corrupted. It's collapsed. Jorge mentioned it. It's a statist system. And here's the fabulous thing I always love about and this is worldwide, by the way. Legislatures, any kind of politician, every time they make a promise, what are they promising you? They're promising you more government. We're going to fix education with what? With more government. We're going to fix the healthcare service or the healthcare system with what? With more government. We're going to resolve the pension retirement system. What are we going to fix it with? More government. And we all know government does fabulous things. And going back to the limited government, again, the idea is there is a role in society for government, but that role is limited. National defense, security, public safety, infrastructure, public works, and judiciary, the courts, the Attorney General's offices, to protect private property and rights.
Hi, I just had a couple questions, and they're follow-up questions. The first one was about your time frame. When you showed your roadmap up there, excuse me, you talked about training the 6,000 and then going up to 24,000 and moving down the line, getting to the point where you influence local society, culture, and then you get to the point where you're legislating. What's your time frame for that? Are you talking about one term? Are you talking about a generation? And then my second question, not really related to that, but to some of the comments that have been made, Guatemala has a long history of socioeconomic, ethnic, and racial discrimination. How are you going to ensure that these groups that have been discriminated for so long have access to education, healthcare, and some of these other services that are now going to be privatized?
Okay, great questions again. Let me answer the last part first. One of the new ministries that are going to be developed or established is a social assistance ministry. Its sole purpose is the distribution of the vouchers to the most needy. Their job as social workers will be to go out and do a study of the socioeconomic circumstances of a particular family or a person and determine if they qualify to receive the voucher. Once they're qualified, they receive the voucher and they are in complete liberty to decide where they want to spend it. It's as good as cash for the service they want to acquire. So, for example, right now what happens is you have programs like Bolsa Solidaria, basically for every child you have, you go and register and you get 300 quetzales a month in cash. What are they going to do with those 300 quetzales? Who knows? Here the idea is that they have to get a medical service, they have to get a pension, they have to get education. That's basically how they get the coverage. Can you roll back to the first question? Sorry.
Yeah, the first question was just about your time frame.
Okay.
How long from the very beginning to training the 6,000 to the point where you're actually legislating?
Okay. So the idea right now, why do we even have, the 6,000 or the 600 and then the 20,000? Those are actually, and if you remember, one of the reforms, the political reform, is the privatization of political parties. Today, part of the regulations is you have to start to set up the first committee to form the party. You have to have 600 people. And the next stage is you have to have 20,000 people distributed in 20 of all the departments in the country. So these are actually legal requirements that we have. The time frame is to get to the 600 in a year's time, and the 20,000 the following year. We're going to create cellular movement. So basically, each leader has to create a cell that then creates another cell. Through that same mechanism, the idea is to grow exponentially and have that be the motor to create the change in public opinion. Now, the part of the story which I keep forgetting to share with you is I kept getting stuck in the middle class part of the urban areas. The other side of the story of that is, surprisingly and very interestingly, in the rural areas, this message is very, very well received. And so we've actually changed our short-term strategy to focus in rural areas. Part of the challenge there is obviously getting the resources to be able to have people like Jorge and myself and all our colleagues to go out to all these rural areas and talk to all these people, train all these people, and make the mind change that needs to happen.
You mentioned that your group is the antithesis of the Fort of Sao Paulo. The Fort of Sao Paulo was composed of the narco guerrilla, the subversive groups, terrorist groups, socialist, communist,
Yep.
If you're the antithesis, who do you represent?
We represent ourselves. We are a group of citizens that are interested in and see no other way than to take political action to get the change that needs to happen. If you think about it, and here's how much of an antithesis we are. We are, for example, we get a lot of people that get close to us because they want to participate in politics, but they come from the old school. And the second comment they have, or the second question they say to us after they say, "Oh, I'm very interested in your ideas," and then they said, "What kind of a job can you get me in government when you go into office?" And the answer is, no job. We're making the government smaller. We're reducing the size. There's no job for you. Now, one thing I can promise is there's going to be a lot more opportunity and a lot better salaries in the marketplace. But you got to compete, and you got to be, you got to be ready to go after it.
And more than a question, I have comments, first of all, and thank you so much because it was an amazing presentation of very basic questions. I am a political analyst, political scientist, and amazing. I am really happy to hear that Guatemalans are having those type of initiative, and I hope things are going to work out because our countries are socialist and they don't even know. Many people, I mean, I've been from Venezuela, many Venezuelans don't know that they are socialists. They believe that they oppose the Maduro regime, for example, but they don't believe in legal governments. They believe the government is dirty. The government is the one who has to give them everything. And this is in conflict with those principles, the classic liberalism. So I just want to give you my thoughts and good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Venezuela is a case study for the world. And anyhow, I'm here and I know that many other Venezuelans, we want for the whole region to succeed. I say we because I know that not only me, but many other Venezuelans, we closely look what is happening everywhere in Latin America. Because we were the strongest constitutional republic in the region. And what I call the Castro Communist franchise, specialized in dismantle constitutional republics, succeed in Venezuela and also in the region. So we want to help. We want to tell you, look at us. Look what happened. Because we, for many reasons, I don't want to discuss it here why we allow this to happen. But sincerely, I hope Guatemalans look at Venezuela, say no to socialism, say no to communism, and embrace capitalism.
Thank you. Great comment. One of the first courses or first modules we give in the training actually discusses the differences between right and left political views. And normally we think of the left, we classify them in two, the soft left and the hard left. The soft left is what you've seen in many Latin American countries, at least in the last 20 years, that use democracy as a channel to go into power. So they use populist rhetoric and they gain power that way. The hard left is what we saw in the late 70s and 80s, which is the guerrilla-style left, that's a violent left. And in the right, you have two rights. You have the mercantilist right, which provides economic privileges. In the U.S. lexicon, it's crony capitalism, which I'm sure everybody's heard of. It was really big in the 30s. Well, I mean, it was really big up for a long time, even today. And the other left is the other right is the good right, or what we call the good right, which is classical liberal principles, which is limited government, free markets, private property.
Good evening, talking about privatization, I'm just curious. How are you planning? Who's going to be owner of the healthcare education? Because elementary private school Guatemala is really expensive. Private university are really expensive. Private hospitals are really expensive. So how it is few families who has the economic power in Guatemala. So in my mind, the Petral, the Castillo, the Novela, they're going to be owner of those healthcare education. So how are you planning to give the opportunity to people as me with no money and give the opportunity to healthcare and education for the poor people?
Okay, great question. All right, the privatization, let's tackle that first. The idea of the privatization is, today the service that the poor get is horrible. Best and easiest way to die is to go and stand in line in San Juan de Dios in Zona 1 And if you got there and you were waiting to get cured or something, you'll probably catch 2 or 3 things while you're standing in line. There's a great anecdote, and we're going to record it if we're able to, of a person that was there, showed up at 3:30 in the morning. Finally, around 6 o'clock in the morning, they gave her a wheelchair. By 9 o'clock, the nurse was back and said, "I'm sorry, I need the wheelchair. There's somebody worse off than you are." So what that tells us is that how ridiculous the system really is. So when we privatize it, the idea is to give the infrastructure as a severance payment to the people who currently operate it. So all the workers in the San Juan de Dios will become owners of that infrastructure. They get to decide how they want to operate. They can operate as a for-profit hospital or clinic. They can operate as an NGO. They can donate it to a religious organization. Again, the idea is to return the liberty and the freedom to these people for them to decide their self-determination. Okay? So it's not going to be the Castillos and the Botran and the Novelas. It's going to be owned by those doctors and those teachers and those social workers. Okay? What's happened with previous privatizations? I don't know if you were around. I wasn't around, but I've heard the stories and studied the stories of Guatel. Guatel was a national telecommunications company. And the way it was privatized was a crony capitalist model. It was a mercantilist model. And here's a really interesting, not a perfect comparison or story, but an interesting comparison of the story. Right about the same time, because we had the neoliberalism movement that took place in the late 80s, early 90s, and going into the late 90s. Basically what the principles, one of the main theses behind that, which was the Washington Consensus, was to privatize state-owned enterprises. And the way they were privatized, at least Guatel was privatized, was who are my buddies, who's going to give me a nice big kickback, and I'll sell them the company. And that's how Guatel was privatized. So what happens? Rather than have the ownership in the hands of the many, it went into the hands of 1 or 2 characters. And again, it's not a perfect comparison, but I'll tell the story of Telmex. Telmex was also privatized by Salinas de Gortari in Mexico. It was the national telecommunications operator. And when Telmex was privatized, it was half crony capitalism. Half went to the richest man in the world, off and on, Carlos Slim. And the other part was put up in the Bolsa de Valores, the Mexican stock market, and sold to the public. And today, Mexico has the largest and most active stock market, not only for that reason, but that's one of the strongest reasons. It was one of the great catalysts which promoted the stock market, and that has given many Mexicans the ability to own stock in many companies and have alternatives of where to invest their funds. Something that sadly in the rest of Latin America is not available. I mean, I'm sure you know that if you wanted to own some stock of Pollo Campero or Cerveza Gallo or Café Barista, or you name your big brand company, it's not possible. That stock is in the hands of the few. There's no stock market. So even if you have the capital and you wanted to invest, you don't even have the ability to. Why is that? Because privatization took place in a crony capitalist model. And so that's why I was saying that's the bad right. And unfortunately, the socialists have had a really good story to tell, and they've convinced, unfortunately, a lot of people to vote for them because they say the right is that side. They haven't heard our story, and they haven't heard our ideas and our principles.
How are your group is trying to create laws that would control the funding that doesn't allow narco-traffic money to get it? Because that's really a great problem in our world.
Mm-hmm. Great question, and it leads me to one of the most controversial policies we have. So I'll save that for the second part. And it's good. I'm glad you're all sitting down because For a lot of people, it blows their mind. First, correctly you stated, it's ley electoral, and that's where it should have stopped. I know, but that's where it should have stopped. Why? Because you need laws to decide how you're going to count the votes, how you're going to organize elections, and how the votes are going to be counted, and who's the winner. You don't need laws for organizing private parties along the lines of political affinity or ideas. If you were to set up let's say a book club that likes fiction books, and I would say, oh no, but for that you have to get 600 qualified Guatemalans to sign on these special pieces of paper that we issue, and you have to do it on a Wednesday, and then you have to go out and get 20,000 people, and then you can do your book club. It's really no different. Why can't, if there's freedom of association, that should include the political process. In terms of funding and drug funding, when we talk about free markets, we talk about truly free markets. And so we're talking about the decriminalization of drugs. There's many countries where this takes place, and there's no social repercussions that are any different than what happens today. The market is what really regulates an economy and human practices. Today, there's drug consumption and there's a drug market in Guatemala, in the United States, and across the planet. And nobody's been able to stop it. I'm trying to think, it's back in the Reagan era where they really took off with the war against drugs. And to this date, it continues. I mean, what's that, 40 years almost? So now, the next question we usually get is, so where has this worked? Well, for example, the Netherlands. The Netherlands, there's consumption of narcotics. Switzerland, even the state provides the locations where people can consume them, and actually, so that they don't commit crimes, subsidizes the use of drugs. Now this is really forward thinking, and it takes a little bit of time to digest it. So take your time with it. And there's a lot more background behind this. And I would love to continue speaking about it. But it's a really, really big conversation. But the short answer is, you legalize the consumption and commercialization of drugs.
Wow, you guys are amazing. Thank you for the questions. We have one more question, but I told Caitlin I will have a teaser. She's my half-daughter, kind of. I just decided to adopt Lucy, which is amazing. But she's one of my interns. I actually have a foundation that we do sustainable families, and we go to forums all over the world. By December, we will have 15 countries just in this year, every continent. And what we're trying to promote, we're working on promoting, is very much these principles. We just met. It wasn't their idea, it wasn't my idea, it's coming from principles, right? So we promote the idea of family as a center of society to empower. But she's my intern, that's what I was saying. She's my intern with the UN was here in Utah, like a month ago. I don't know, my time is here because half the time I'm in another continent. But she was absolutely brilliant. So she's gonna, sorry, that's all the pressure on me now. But she has, this is the last question. And then remember, he's exhausted. We did get home at 1 in the morning yesterday, but he's very fine. If you guys are gonna sit and want to ask questions while we clean and stuff, also my brother-in-law is going to sing. My dad wants to recite a poem. Don't feel like you need to stay. It's a Guatemalan thing, and we can be off all night. Just remember, by 11, I want you to get out of here on the church.
I don't buy.
I was just wondering more specifically how you get agencies out there to educate people on what kind of government we live under and what changes they're trying to make.
Okay, great question again. All great questions tonight. The best method at this stage where we're at now is person to person. I'll explain a little bit of how the cellular structure works. I belong to Genesis. Genesis is the first cell that was established that Jorge made reference to. We basically meet once a week, and we have a very particular structure. I don't know if any of you here are Rotaries, but Rotaries and many other organizations, keep sort of a very specific agenda. And we follow FOPRA. The training is our first module, and then we look at organization and what we're doing organizationally, and then we look at recruitment, we look at fundraising, and we look at political activism. And so we go through that same process. The idea is to form, each of us has our own cell, and then the people in our cell have another cell, and then the people in their cell have another cell. The big shift that we're doing now is we're focusing on building cells outside of Guatemala City. Again, that is the largest proportion of the population that is dissatisfied with the current political offering, and that's where we see the greatest opportunity, is to speak to all those people who are apathetic, who are unmotivated, who don't see hope and don't see the possibility of change. And we think those are the people who we want to be part of this change, because we're not, there's a term we use, politiquero, which is your standard politician who would, right now they're talking about, I'm speaking with this particular group, so I will tell them what they want to hear, and then I'll turn around and I'll speak to this other group and I'll tell them what this person wants to hear. In that sense, we're really bad politiqueros, because the same thing you heard me tell you tonight is what I share with people every day. And the story never changes. I mean, I may skip one part or forget to share another part because it's a very complete strategy. But in the end, it's the same, the same conversation every time.